On Thursday, Keir Starmer's Labour Party won one of the biggest majorities in British electoral history. A remarkable turnaround from a party that was soundly beaten by Boris Johnson's Conservatives at the last election only 5 years ago. Starmer's reaction was understandably triumphant. In his victory speech, he declared, "We did it," and acknowledged the relief of the British people that the Tories had finally been ousted. But while Starmer's victory is clearly an impressive achievement, especially given where the party was in electoral terms, at the ballot box, Labour actually underperformed the polls, and his stonking great majority in Parliament disguises the fact that Labour won remarkably few votes, benefiting more than ever from the distorting majoritarian effect of first past the post. In fact, Labour actually saw the highest vote-to-seat ratio for a winning party ever, with Starmer winning 1.85 times as many seats as votes. So in this video, we're going to have a look at why this election was arguably the least democratic in British political history, what this says about first past the post, and what it might mean for this Labour government going forward. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, we should start by saying that the undemocratic thing here isn't merely the fact that Labour have a majority of seats despite not winning a majority of votes. That's par for the course in the UK's majoritarian first-past-the-post system, where 40% or so of the vote is usually enough for a majority of seats, and parties basically never win more than 50%. At the last election in 2019, for instance, Boris Johnson won 365 seats, well above the 326 required for a majority, and about 56% of all available seats, with just 44% of the vote. However, in this election, Labour won a majority on the lowest share of the popular vote in post-war history. Not only that, but this election also saw the second lowest turnout in post-war history, coming at just a bit over 59%, and basically the joint second largest majority, on a par with Tony Blair's second election in 2001, and just a few seats behind Blair's historic landslide in 1997. All in all, Starmer won roughly 63% of all seats, with just 34% of the vote, and just 20% of all registered voters. For context, that means he actually won fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and in 2019. Even then, this is only because Labour's vote share increased by something like 20% in Scotland. It was flat in England compared to 2019, and actually fell by 4 points in Wales. Starmer also won 7% fewer votes than Blair in 2001, when Blair won 41% of the vote, but got basically an identical number of seats. All in all, this is by far and away the highest vote-to-seat ratio for the largest party in basically all of British parliamentary history. Labour's seat share was 1.85 times as large as their vote share. For context, in a proportional electoral system, the seat-to-vote ratio for the largest party, or any party for that matter, would be about 1, i.e. you get about as many seats as you do votes, measured in percentage terms. You'd obviously expect it to be above 1 in a majoritarian system like first past the post, which is designed to give outsized majorities to the biggest party for reasons of political stability. But for most of post-war history, this ratio has hovered between 1.1 and 1.4, and the highest it's ever been before is 1.55. The 1.85 ratio that Starmer has achieved is both a historical and statistical anomaly of extreme magnitude, and this is why what happened on Thursday was arguably the least democratic, or at least the least representative, election result in British political history. Now, Starmer and his allies will say that this is in some sense an unfair metric, for at least two reasons. First, turnout, especially amongst Labour voters, was apparently suppressed by the fact that, thanks to copious amounts of pre-election polling, everyone knew that Labour were going to win. This meant that even would-be Labour voters apparently stayed home, which is presumably one of the reasons they slightly underperformed the polls. Second, one of the reasons that Labour's vote-to-seat ratio is so high is because Labour and Lib Dem voters did a whole load of tactical voting. In other words, in constituencies where Lib Dems were competing with the Tories, would-be Labour voters lent their vote to the Lib Dems, and vice versa. This is because there's currently not that much ideological space between Labour and the Lib Dems at the moment, and many of their voters' main priority is kicking out the Tories. Starmer will claim that tactical voting between Labour and Lib Dem voters artificially suppressed Labour's vote share, while maximising their seat share. However, it's worth noting that tactical voting would also inflate the Labour vote, as Lib Dem voters lend their votes to Labour as well. And even if we take these two caveats into account, this was still the most unrepresentative result ever. So, what difference does this actually make? Well, as we see it, there are two potential consequences. The first is that it'll make voters and politicians more sceptical of first past the post, especially if Labour ends up underperforming in their first term. Voters will obviously be disappointed if the 14 years of managed decline under the Conservatives gives way to yet more disappointment under Starmer, but they'll be especially irritated by the fact that 2/3 of them didn't even vote for him. While electoral reform doesn't look likely in this parliament, given how much Labour have benefited from first past the post, it might rise up the agenda, both because of quite how disproportionate the result is, and the fact that the British right have now experienced the downsides of first past the post, with the split between the Tories and Reform hurting both of them. But the main consequence is that it'll probably make Labour a lot more nervous than you might expect if you just glanced at their seat tally. Starmer's majority is large, but it's also shallow, thanks to strong showings by the Lib Dems, Greens, Reform, and even a host of pro-Palestine independents. Labour majorities at the constituency level are smaller than ever. On top of that, polling suggests that voters were mainly motivated by anti-Tory sentiment, not any particular enthusiasm for Labour, as evidenced by the weak turnout and Starmer's own relatively mediocre approval ratings. This means that they're unlikely to be loyal at the next election, and a second term probably isn't guaranteed. So a lot will depend on whether or not Labour can deliver in their first 5 years. All in all, it remains to be seen whether this Labour landslide is like Blair in 1997, which preceded 13 years of Labour dominance, or like the other 20th century landslides in 1924 and 1945, which both quickly gave way to defeat at the next election after the electorate were disappointed. Regardless, this is clearly a monumental election for the UK, and when these kinds of elections happen, people tend to like to save newspapers and magazines with the headlines for posterity. The best way you could possibly do that is by picking up a copy of Too Long,
our 60-page, high-quality magazine full of TLDR's very best journalism. This issue is focused on the UK election, diving deep into the campaign, the results, and how the winners plan to fix Britain. It's more than just Britain, though, with stories including the European parliamentary elections, the countries likely to join the EU next, the latest from Gaza, the rise of Milei, and, of course, the US election. Now, we've decided to make the magazine for two reasons. Firstly, it allows our journalists to write in more detail, diving deeper and ignoring algorithmic restrictions to produce the best work we can. And secondly, it's a good way for you to support TLDR and will help us to produce free YouTube videos as long as we can. If you're interested, then you can pick up a copy from our website, where we're selling 2 editions of the magazine. Firstly, there's the standard edition, and then there's the premium edition, which gets your name printed in the thank you section of the magazine, and exclusive access to our behind the scenes podcast. Oh, and by the way, we're going to be making an issue of Too Long every 4 months. So if you want to ensure that you never miss an issue, then you can subscribe, which gets you a 25% discount. If you have more questions, there's a full Q&A linked in the description, where you'll also find a link to our store. And while you're there, make sure you use the code ELECTIONWEEK to get an additional £2 off any purchase. Thanks so much for hearing me out, and if you are interested, please do pick up a copy, as it's a great way to support our journalism and help us to continue making free YouTube videos as long as we can.